Nobody disagrees about the sequence of major events from 1848 to 1861 that led ultimately to the outbreak of the Civil War between the Union and the Confederacy. Facts in themselves, however, do not automatically assemble themselves into a convincing interpretation of why war occurred when it did. Historians have identified at least four main causes of the conflict between the North and the South. One, slavery as a growing moral issue in the North versus its defense and expansion in the South. Two, constitutional disputes over the nature of the federal union and states' rights. Three, economic differences between the industrializing North and the agricultural South over such issues as tariffs, banking, and internal improvements. And four, political blunders and extremism on both sides, which some historians conclude resulted in an unnecessary war. The issue of slavery in the territories gained in the Mexican War became the focus of sectional differences in the late 1840s. The Wilmot Proviso, which excluded slavery from the new territories, would have upset the Compromise of 1820 and the delicate balance of 15 free and 15 slave states. The Proviso's defeat only intensified sectional feelings. On the issue of how to deal with these new Western territories, there were essentially three conflicting positions. First, the Free Soil movement. Northern Democrats and Whigs supported the Wilmot Proviso and the position that all African Americans, slave and free, should be excluded from the Mexican Cession. While abolitionists advocated eliminating slavery everywhere, many Northerners who opposed the westward expansion of slavery did not oppose slavery in the South. They sought to keep the West a land of opportunity for whites only, so that the white majority would not have to compete with the labor of slaves or free blacks. In 1848, Northerners who opposed allowing slavery in the territories organized the Free Soil Party, which adopted the slogan "Free Soil, Free Labor, and Free Men." In addition to its chief objective, preventing the extension of slavery, the new party also advocated free homesteads and internal improvements. The second would be the Southern position. Most whites in the South viewed any attempts to restrict the expansion of slavery as a violation of their constitutional right to take and use their property as they wished. They saw the Free Soilers, and especially the abolitionists, as intent on the ultimate destruction of slavery. More moderate Southerners favored extending the Missouri Compromise line of 3630 westward to the Pacific Ocean and permitting territories north of that line to be non-slave. And lastly, popular sovereignty. Lewis Cass, a Democratic senator from Michigan, proposed a compromise solution that soon won considerable support from both moderate Northerners and moderate Southerners. Instead of Congress determining whether to allow slavery in a new Western territory or state, Cass suggested that the matter be determined by a vote of the people who settled the territory. Cass's approach to the problem was known as squatter or popular sovereignty. In 1848, the Democrats nominated Senator Cass and adopted a platform pledged to popular sovereignty. The Whigs nominated Mexican war hero General Zachary Taylor, who had never been involved in politics and took no position on slavery in the territories. A third party, the Free Soil Party, nominated former President Martin Van Buren. It consisted of conscious Whigs who opposed slavery and anti-slavery Democrats. The latter group were ridiculed as barn burners because their defection threatened to destroy the Democratic Party. Taylor narrowly defeated Cass in part because of the vote given the Free Soil Party in such key northern states as New York and Pennsylvania. The gold rush of 1849 and the influx of about 100,000 settlers into California created the need for law and order in the West. In 1849, Californians drafted a constitution for their new state, a constitution that banned slavery. Even though President Taylor was a Southern slaveholder himself, he supported the immediate admission of both California and New Mexico as free states. Taylor's plan sparked talk of secession among the fire eaters, or the radicals, in the South. Some Southern extremists even met in Nashville in 1850 to discuss secession. But by this time, however, the astute Henry Clay had proposed yet another compromise for solving the political crisis. First, admit California to the Union as a free state. Second, divide the remainder of the Mexican cession into two territories, Utah and New Mexico, and allow the settlers in these territories to decide the slavery issue by majority vote or popular sovereignty. Third, give the land in dispute between Texas and the New Mexico Territory to the new territories in return for the federal government assuming Texas's public debt of $10 million. Fourthly, ban the slave trade in the District of Columbia, but permit whites to hold slaves as before. And lastly, adopt a new fugitive slave law and enforce it rigorously. This would be a much stricter fugitive slave law. In the ensuing Senate debate over the compromise proposal, the three congressional giants of the age, Henry Clay of Kentucky, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, delivered the last great speeches of their lives. They all three die soon after the compromise. Webster argued for compromise in order to save the Union, and in so doing alienated the Massachusetts abolitionists who formed the base of his support. Calhoun argued against compromise and insisted that the South be given equal rights in the acquired territory. Northern opposition to compromise came from younger anti-slavery lawmakers such as Senator William H. Seward of New York, who argued that a higher law than the Constitution existed. Opponents managed to prevail until the sudden death in 1850 of President Taylor, who had also opposed Clay's plan. Succeeding him was a strong supporter of compromise, Vice President Millard Fillmore. Stephen A. Douglas, a politically astute young senator from Illinois, engineered different coalitions to pass each part of the compromise separately. President Fillmore readily signed the bills into law. The passage of the Compromise of 1850 brought time for the Union. Because California was admitted as a free state, the compromise added to the North's political power, and the political debate deepened the commitment of many Northerners to save the Union from secession. On the other hand, parts of the compromise became sources of controversy, especially the new fugitive slave law and the provision for popular sovereignty. For a brief period, the 4 years between the Compromise of 1850 and the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, political tensions abated slightly. However, the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act and the publication of a best-selling anti-slavery novel kept the slavery question in the forefront of public attention in both the North and South. The passage of the strict fugitive slave law persuaded many Southerners to accept the loss of California to the abolitionists and free soilers. Yet the enforcement of the new law of the North was bitterly and sometimes forcibly resisted by anti-slavery Northerners. In effect, therefore, enforcement of the new law drove a wedge between the North and the South. The law's chief purpose was to track down runaway or fugitive slaves who had escaped to a northern state, capture them, and return them to their southern owners. The law placed fugitive slave cases under the exclusive jurisdiction of the federal government and authorized special U.S. commissioners to issue warrants to arrest fugitives. Captured persons who claimed to be a free African American and not a runaway slave were denied the right of trial by jury. Citizens who attempted to hide a runaway or obstruct enforcement of the law were subject to heavy penalties. The Underground Railroad, the fabled network of conductors and stations, was a loose network of northern free blacks and courageous ex-slaves with the help of some white abolitionists who helped escaped slaves reach freedom in the North or in Canada. The most famous conductor was an escaped slave woman, Harriet Tubman, who made at least 19 trips into the South to help some 300 slaves escape. Free blacks in the North and abolitionists who organized vigilance committees to protect fugitive slaves from the slave catchers. Once the Civil War broke out, African American leaders such as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth continued to work for the emancipation of slaves and to support black soldiers in the Union cause. To reiterate, sectional problems exist with the addition of California, especially as it entered as a free state. The Southern fire eaters stirred the pot with talk of secession, and the North exercised their states' rights. As slave catchers crossed the Mason-Dixon line in search of runaways and tensions mounted, the North began to respond. Keep in mind, the North is not made up of abolitionists, but instead free soilers who chose to cry states' rights. The North responded to the more stringent fugitive slave law with personal liberty laws. These laws protected the state right of determining slave or free. As northern states chose to be slave-free, these states also agreed it was the right of the state to choose to ignore laws such as the fugitive slave law. With these personal liberty laws, a deeper schism was drawn between the slave and free states. A slave catcher by the name of Edward Prigg was hired by a Maryland slave owner to retrieve a former slave in the state of Pennsylvania. Operating under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, Prigg crossed state lines in search of the so-called fugitive. The former slave was set free by her former master, but did not carry emancipation papers, thus making her fair game in the eyes of the former master's heirs. Pennsylvania prosecuted Edward Prigg for the unlawful kidnapping of the former slave and her children. He was convicted, but as the case was brought to the Supreme Court, Prigg was not only set free, but stated Pennsylvania state law concerning the freedom of slaves in free states violated a person's right to their own property. The impact of the case led to the addition of a stricter fugitive slave law added to the Compromise of 1850 and drew an even wider wedge between the North and the South. The North enacted a series of statewide personal liberty laws, as noted before, and the South saw the attempt to thwart slave catchers as a violation of the spirit of the U.S. Constitution itself. Popular books as well as unpopular laws stirred the emotions of the people of all regions. The most influential book of its day was a novel about the conflict between an enslaved man named Tom and the brutal white slave owner Simon Legree. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852 by the Northern writer Harriet Beecher Stowe moved a generation of Northerners as well as many Europeans to regard all slave owners as monstrously cruel and inhuman. Southerners condemned the untruths in the novel and looked upon it as one more proof of the North's incurable prejudice against the Southern way of life. Later, when President Lincoln met Stowe, he is reported to have said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." Although it did not appear until 1857, Hinton R. Helpert's book of nonfiction, Impending Crisis of the South, attacked slavery from another angle. The author, a native of North Carolina, used statistics to demonstrate to fellow Southerners that slavery weakened the South's economy. Southern states acted quickly to ban the book, but it was widely distributed in the North by anti-slavery and free soil leaders. Responding to the Northern literature that condemned slavery as evil, pro-slavery Southern whites counteracted by arguing that slavery was just the opposite, a positive good for slave and master alike. They argued that slavery was sanctioned by the Bible and was firmly grounded in philosophy and history. Pro-slavery authors questioned the principle of equal rights for unequal men and attacked the capitalist wage system as worse than slavery, calling Northern wage workers wage slaves, forced to work long hours in factories and mines. The potency of the slavery controversy increased political instability as shown in the weakening of the two major parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, and in a disastrous application of popular sovereignty in the territory of Kansas. Signs of trouble for the Whig Party were apparent in the 1852 election for president. The Whigs nominated another military hero of the Mexican War, General Winfield Scott. Attempting to ignore the slavery issue, the Whig campaign concentrated on the party's innocuous plans for improving roads and harbors. But Scott quickly discovered that sectional issues could not be held in check. The anti-slavery and Southern factions of the party fell to quarreling, and the party was on the verge of splitting apart. The Democrats nominated a safe compromise candidate, Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire. Though a Northerner, Pierce was acceptable to Southern Democrats because he supported the fugitive slave law. In the Electoral College vote, Pierce and the Democrats won all but 4 states in a sweep that suggested the days of the Whig Party were numbered. With the Democrats firmly in control of national policy, both in the White House and in Congress, a new law was passed that was to have disastrous consequences. Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois devised a plan for building a railroad and promoting Western settlement, while at the same time increasing the value of his own real estate holdings in Chicago. Douglas needed to win Southern approval for his plan to build a transcontinental railroad through the central United States with a major terminal in Chicago. Southern Democrats preferred a more southerly route for the railroad. To obtain Southern approval for his railroad route, Douglas introduced a bill to divide the Nebraska Territory into 2 parts, the Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory, and allow settlers in each territory to decide whether to allow slavery or not. Since these territories were located north of the 3630 line, Douglas's bill gave Southern slave owners an opportunity to expand slavery that previously had been closed to them by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Northern Democrats condemned the bill as a surrender to the slave power. After 3 months of bitter debate, both houses of Congress passed Douglas's bill as the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, and President Pierce signed it into law. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, in effect, repealed the Missouri Compromise that had kept a lid on regional tensions for more than 3 decades. After 1854, the conflicts between anti-slavery and pro-slavery forces exploded, both in Kansas and on the floor of the United States Senate. Stephen Douglas, the sponsor of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, expected the slavery issue in the territory to be settled peacefully by the anti-slavery farmers from the Midwest who migrated to Kansas. These settlers did in fact constitute a majority of the population. But slaveholders from the neighboring state of Missouri also set up homesteads in Kansas, chiefly as a means of winning control of the territory for the South. Northern abolitionists and free soilers responded by organizing the New England Emigrant Aid Company in 1855, which paid for the transportation of anti-slavery settlers to Kansas. Fighting soon broke out between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups, and the territory became known as Bleeding Kansas. Pro-slavery Missourians, mockingly called border ruffians by their enemies, crossed the border to create a pro-slavery legislature in Lecompton, Kansas. Anti-slavery settlers refused to recognize this government and created their own legislature in Topeka. In 1856, pro-slavery forces attacked the free soil town of Lawrence, killing 2 and destroying homes and businesses. 2 days later, John Brown, an abolitionist who was born in Connecticut and living in New York, retaliated. He and his sons attacked a pro-slavery farm settlement, killing 5 settlers. In Washington, the Pierce administration kept aloof from the turmoil in Kansas. It did nothing to keep order in the territory and failed to support honest elections there. As Bleeding Kansas became bloodier, the Democratic Party became ever more divided between its northern and southern factions. The violence in Kansas spilled over into the halls of the U.S. Congress. In 1856, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner verbally attacked the Democratic administration in his speech, The Crime Against Kansas. His remarks included personal charges against South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler. Butler's nephew, Congressman Preston Brooks, defended his absent uncle's honor by walking into the Senate chamber and beating Sumner over the head with a cane. Brooks explained that dueling was too good for Sumner, but a cane was fit for a dog. Sumner never fully recovered from the attack. Brooks's actions outraged the North, and the House voted to censure him. Southerners, however, applauded Brooks's deed and sent him numerous canes to replace the one he broke against Sumner. The Sumner-Brooks incident was another sign of growing passions on both sides. The increasing tensions over slavery divided Northern and Southern Democrats, and it completely broke apart the Whig Party. In hindsight, it is clear that the breakup of truly national political parties in the mid-1850s paralleled the breakup of the Union. The new parties came into being at this time, one temporary, the other permanent. Both played a role in bringing about the demise of a major national party, the Whigs. In addition to sectional divisions between North and South, there was also in the mid-1850s growing ethnic tension in the North between native-born Protestant Americans and immigrant Germans and Irish Catholics. Nativist hostility to these newcomers led to the formation of the American Party, or the Know-Nothing Party, as it was more commonly known, because party members commonly responded, "I know nothing," to political questions. The Know-Nothings drew support away from the Whigs at a time when that party was reeling from its defeat in the 1852 election. Their one core issue was opposition to Catholics and immigrants who, in the 1840s and 1850s, were entering northern cities in large numbers. Although the Know-Nothings won a few local and state elections in the mid-1850s and helped to weaken the Whigs, they quickly lost influence as sectional issues again became paramount. The Republican Party was founded in Wisconsin in 1854 as a direct reaction to the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Composed of a coalition of free soilers and anti-slavery Whigs and Democrats, its overriding purpose was to oppose the spread of slavery in the territories, not to end slavery itself. Its first platform of 1854 called for the repeal of both the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Fugitive Slave Law. As violence increased in Kansas, more and more people, including some abolitionists, joined the Republican Party, and it was soon the second largest in the country. But because it remained in these years strictly a northern or sectional party, its success alienated and threatened the South. The Republicans' first test of strength came in the presidential election of 1856. Their nominee for president was a senator from California, the young explorer John C. Fremont. The Republican platform called for no expansion of slavery, free homesteads, and the pro-business protective tariff. The Know-Nothings also competed strongly in this election, with their candidate, former President Millard Fillmore, winning 20% of the popular vote. As the one major national party, the Democrats expected to win. They nominated James Buchanan of Pennsylvania, rejecting both President Pierce and Stephen Douglas because they were too closely identified with the controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act. As expected, the Democrat ticket won a majority of both the popular and electoral vote. But the Republicans made a remarkably strong showing for a sectional party. In the Electoral College, Fremont carried 11 of the 16 free states. People could predict that the anti-slavery Republicans might soon win the White House without a single vote from the South. The election of 1856 foreshadowed the emergence of a powerful political party that would win all but 4 presidential elections between 1860 and 1932. Both the Democrats' position of popular sovereignty and the Republicans' stand against the expansion of slavery received serious blows during the Buchanan administration from 1857 to 1861. Republicans attacked Buchanan as a weak president. One of Buchanan's first challenges as president in 1857 was to decide whether to accept or reject a pro-slavery state constitution for Kansas submitted by the Southern legislature at Lecompton. Buchanan knew that the Lecompton Constitution, as it was called, did not have the support of the majority of settlers. Even so, he asked Congress to accept the document and admit Kansas as a slave state. Congress did not do so because many Democrats, including Stephen Douglas, joined with the Republicans in rejecting the Lecompton Constitution. The next year, 1858, the pro-slavery document was overwhelmingly rejected by Kansas settlers, most of whom were anti-slavery Republicans. Congressional and presidential mistakes contributed to the sectional crisis of the 1850s. Then the Supreme Court worsened the crisis when it infuriated many Northerners with the controversial pro-slavery decision in the case of a slave named Dred Scott. Scott had been held in slavery in Missouri and then taken to the Free Territory of Wisconsin, where he lived for 2 years before returning to Missouri. Arguing that his residence on free soil made him a free citizen, Scott sued for his freedom in Missouri in 1846. The case worked its way through the court system. It finally reached the Supreme Court, which rendered its decision in March 1857, only 2 days after Buchanan was sworn in as president. Presiding over the court was Chief Justice Roger Taney, a Southern Democrat. A majority of the court decided against Scott and gave these reasons. 1. Dred Scott had no right to sue in a federal court because the framers of the Constitution did not intend African Americans to be U.S. citizens. 2. Congress did not have the power to deprive any person of property without due process of law. If slaves were a form of property, then Congress could not exclude slavery from any federal territory. And 3, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because it excluded slavery from Wisconsin and other northern territories. The court's ruling delighted Southern Democrats and infuriated Northern Republicans. In effect, the Supreme Court declared that all parts of the Western territories were open to slavery. Republicans denounced the Dred Scott decision as the greatest crime in the annals of the Republic. Because of the timing of the decision, right after Buchanan's inauguration, many Northerners suspected that the Democratic president and the Democratic majority on the Supreme Court, including Taney, had secretly planned the Dred Scott decision, hoping that it would settle the slavery question once and for all. The decision increased Northerners' suspicions of the slave power conspiracy and induced thousands of foreign Democrats to vote Republican. Northern Democrats, such as Senator Stephen Douglas, were left with the almost impossible task of supporting popular sovereignty without repudiating the Dred Scott decision. Douglas's hopes for a sectional compromise and his ambitions for the presidency were both in jeopardy. In 1858, the focus of the nation was on Stephen Douglas's campaign for re-election as senator from Illinois. Challenging him for the Senate seat was a successful trial lawyer and former member of the Illinois legislature, Abraham Lincoln. The Republican candidate had served only one 2-year term in Congress in the 1840s as a Whig. Nationally, he was an unknown compared to Douglas, the champion of popular sovereignty and possibly the best hope for holding the nation together if elected president in 1860. Lincoln was not an abolitionist. Even so, as a moderate who was against the expansion of slavery, he spoke effectively of slavery as a moral issue. "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong," said Lincoln. Accepting the Illinois Republicans' nomination, the candidate delivered his celebrated House Divided speech that won him fame. "This government," said Lincoln, "cannot endure permanently half slave and half free," a statement that made Southerners view Lincoln as radical. In 7 campaign debates held in different Illinois towns, Lincoln shared the platform with his famous opponent, Douglas. The Republican challenger attacked Douglas's seeming indifference to slavery as a moral issue. In a debate in Freeport, Illinois, Lincoln challenged Douglas to reconcile popular sovereignty with the Dred Scott decision. In what became known as the Freeport Doctrine, Douglas responded that slavery could not exist in a community if the local citizens did not pass laws or slave codes mandating it. His views angered Southern Democrats because, from their point of view, Douglas did not go far enough in supporting the implications of the Dred Scott decision. Douglas won his campaign for re-election to the U.S. Senate. In the long run, however, he lost ground in his own party by alienating Southern Democrats. Lincoln, on the other hand, emerged from the debates as a national figure and a leading contender for the Republican nomination for president in 1860. Outside Illinois, the Republicans did well in the congressional elections of 1858, which alarmed many Southerners. They worried not only about the anti-slavery plank of the Republicans' program, but also about the party's economic program, which favored the interests of Northern industrialists at the expense of the South. The higher tariffs pledged in the Republican platform could only help Northern business and hurt the South's dependence on the export of cotton. Therefore, Southerners feared that a Republican victory in 1860 would spell disaster for their economic interests and also threaten their constitutional right, as affirmed by the Supreme Court, to hold slaves as property. If this were not enough of a cause for alarm, Northern radicals provided money to John Brown, the man who had massacred 5 farmers in Kansas in 1856. John Brown confirmed the South's worst fears of radical abolitionism when he tried to start a slave uprising in Virginia. In October 1859, he led a small band of followers, including his 4 sons and some former slaves, in an attack on the Federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. His impractical plan was to use guns from the arsenal to arm Virginia's slaves, whom he expected to rise up in general revolt. Federal troops under the command of Robert E. Lee captured Brown and his band after a 2-day siege. Brown and 6 of his followers were tried for treason, convicted, and hanged by the state of Virginia. Moderates in the North, including Republican leaders, condemned Brown's use of violence, but Southerners were not convinced by their words. Southern whites saw the raid as final proof of the North's true intentions to use slave revolts to destroy the South. Because John Brown spoke with simple eloquence at his trial of his humanitarian motives in wanting to free the slaves, he was hailed as a martyr by many anti-slavery Northerners. A few years later, when Civil War broke out, John Brown was celebrated by advancing Northern armies singing, "Glory, glory, hallelujah, his soul is marching on." After John Brown's raid, more and more Americans understood that their country was moving to the brink of disintegration. The presidential election of 1860 would be a test if the Union could survive. As 1860 began, the Democratic Party represented the last practical hope for coalition and compromise. The Democrats held their national nominating convention in Charleston, South Carolina. Stephen Douglas was the party's leading candidate for the person most capable of winning the presidency. However, his nomination was blocked by a combination of angry Southerners and supporters of President Buchanan. After deadlocking at Charleston, the Democrats held a second convention in Baltimore. Many delegates from the slave states walked out, enabling the remaining delegates to nominate Douglas on a platform of popular sovereignty and enforcement of the fugitive slave law. Southern Democrats then held their own convention in Baltimore and nominated Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky as their candidate. The Southern Democratic platform called for the unrestricted extension of slavery in the territories and the annexation of Cuba, a land where slavery was already flourishing. When the Republicans met in Chicago, they enjoyed the prospect of an easy win over the divided Democrats. They made the most of their advantage by drafting a platform that appealed strongly to the economic self-interest of Northerners and Westerners. In addition to calling for the exclusion of slavery from the territories, the Republican platform promised to protect a protective tariff for industry, free land for homesteaders, and internal improvements to encourage Western settlement, including a railroad to the Pacific. To ensure victory, the Republicans turned away from Senator William H. Seward, a well-known leader but more radical on slavery, to the strong debater from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, a candidate who could carry the key Midwestern states of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. One cloud on the horizon darkened the Republicans' otherwise bright future. In the South, secessionists warned that if Lincoln was elected president, their states would leave the Union. Fearing the consequences of a Republican victory, a group of former Whigs, Know-Nothings, and moderate Democrats formed a new party, the Constitutional Union Party. For president, they nominated John Bell of Tennessee. The party's platform pledged enforcement of the laws and the Constitution, and above all, preserving the Union. The Republican Party platform in 1860 followed this outline. First, it supported a non-extension of slavery, which would have supported the free soilers. It supported protective tariffs, which would have helped Northern industrialists. There was no abridgment of rights for immigrants. This would have been a disappointment for the Know-Nothings. It gave government aid to build a Pacific Railroad. This would help the North as well as the Western territories. It supported internal improvements at the federal expense, which again would support the North and West especially. And lastly, it supported free homesteads for the public domain, which would have supported farmers and would have been a draw for immigrants. While Douglas campaigned across the country, Lincoln confidently remained at home in Springfield, Illinois, meeting with Republican leaders and giving statements to the press. The election results were predictable. Lincoln carried every one of the free states of the North, which represented a solid majority of 59% of the electoral votes. He won only 39.8% of the popular vote, however, and would therefore be a minority president. Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, carried the Deep South, leaving Douglas and Bell with just a few electoral votes in the border states. Together, the two Democrats, Douglas and Breckinridge, received many more popular votes than Lincoln, the Republican. Nevertheless, the new political reality was that the populous free states had enough electoral votes to select a president without the need for a single electoral vote from the South. The Republicans controlled neither the Congress nor the Supreme Court. Even so, the election of Lincoln was all that Southern secessionists needed to call for immediate disunion. In December 1860, a special convention in South Carolina voted unanimously to secede. Within the next 6 weeks, other state conventions in Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas did the same. In February 1861, representatives of the 7 states of the Deep South met in Montgomery, Alabama, and created the Confederate States of America. The constitution of this would-be Southern nation was similar to the United States Constitution, except that the Confederacy placed limits on the government's power to impose tariffs and restrict slavery. Elected president and vice president of the Confederacy were Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi and Alexander Stephens of Georgia. Okay, so the essential question focuses on the Crittenden Compromise. The Crittenden Compromise was a last-ditch effort in an attempt to secure peace and avoid war. So what you need to look for is your ability to prove why the Crittenden Compromise would never have been accepted and agreed upon in December of 1860, and take into account these 7 things. 1, the terms of the compromise. 2, timing. 3, Lincoln's viewpoints. 4, Congress in 1860. 5, the Republicans and the Democrats at this time. The long and short-term causes of the Civil War, and lastly, William Seward's role.